They thought they could take my land and turn it into a luxury resort without consequences. You know that saying that when something seems too good to be true, it usually isn't? Well, these people from the Residents Association have clearly never heard of that. Because they looked at a piece of land that didn't belong to them, puffed up their chests with arrogance, and decided they could build a resort there, as if they owned the world. And guess what? The land was mine. Not rented, not borrowed, not negotiable. Mine. A piece of land inherited from my family, which I intended to keep exactly the way it was. Free, untouched, far from the clutches of any idiot amateur urban planners. But the HOA, this organization that started out as a group of neighbors wanting to define the color of fences and now operated as if it were a parallel government, decided that my land would be perfect for a community leisure space. Or, as they would later call it, the disaster that destroyed their bank accounts. The whole thing began subtly, as all tragedies do. First came the friendly warnings. Hey, we notice that your land is a bit empty. Have you thought about doing something useful with it? Then there were the flyers with suggestions. A tennis court, a swimming pool, an events center. Of course, all this would require me to share the land with the community. And when did they realize I wasn't going to give in? Well, then they dropped the facade of good intentions. First, a ridiculous piece of paper, full of vague terms about improvement for the community and utilization of unused space. Then there were the whispers among the neighbors. He's holding back the growth of the neighborhood. Why does he need so much space for himself? It could benefit everyone. The real bombshell came the following month. I left for a 2-week trip, and when I returned, my piece of paradise had been transformed into a construction site. Construction sites. Yes, machines, workers, fresh cement, and a beautiful sign at the entrance with a pompous name, HOA Grand Retreat, a space for everyone. For everyone. Except for me, of course. It was a resort under construction. Not a playground, not a modest swimming pool. A resort with a reception area, a gourmet area, and a bloody water fountain in the middle. I stood there, staring at it, trying to decide whether to scream or just start digging a hole to bury those responsible. But then I realized they had made a mistake. A beautiful, perfect, spectacular mistake. Because, by going ahead without my permission, without concrete legal approval, without a signed contract or any trace of valid paperwork, they had just got themselves into the biggest mess of their lives. I just had to let them sink further. The initial anger passed quickly. In its place came something much more satisfying: expectation. The HOA thought it had won, that they could take my land without consequences, as if they were the rulers of the neighborhood, and I was a mere commoner with no rights. But what they didn't know was that they were digging their own hole with a solid gold shovel, and I was going to let them dig until they couldn't get out. So I did what any intelligent person would do. Nothing. I didn't knock on their door. I didn't call to complain. I didn't get into arguments about who was right. None of that. Because fighting at that moment wouldn't have done any good. If I wanted the punishment to be complete, I had to wait until they were up to their necks in it. And that's exactly what happened. Over the next few days, the site turned into pandemonium. Machines, material trucks, bricklayers moving around, architects taking measurements, and inspectors who had clearly been paid to pretend that it was completely legal. The HOA was throwing money at money as if they were eccentric millionaires buying an island. It was a marvelous spectacle of arrogance and financial recklessness. Little by little, I began to see the attractions taking shape. First, they erected a reception desk because, of course, an illegal resort needed a sophisticated entry point. Then came a wooden deck with sun loungers, perfect for neighbors who wanted to pretend they were vacationing in a 5-star hotel without having to pay anything. And then came the swimming pool. Ah, the pool, huge, sparkling, surrounded by landscaping that probably cost more than a luxury car. I wondered what they thought was going to happen. Did they think I would just accept it? That one day, After seeing everything finished, I would clap my hands and say, "Wow, you've done a great job. Of course you can have the land." Was that the level of delusion? When they realized I wasn't taking part in the celebration, they started sending me messages. First they were nice. "We need to talk about your land." Then came the messages. "We believe that a fair deal can be done." And then, when they realized I wasn't falling for the bait, they went for pure arrogance. "The community has already decided that this project is essential. Wouldn't it be better to cooperate?" Cooperate. As if I were a rebellious employee who refused to follow orders. As if my property was a small inconvenient detail in their grandiose plans. But the truth was that the HOA's arrogance was also its greatest weakness. They thought they were untouchable, convinced that their house rules had more power than property laws. Only, unlike me, they hadn't thought through every detail before acting. The days went by, and, as the work progressed, the attempts to contact them increased. Some members of the HOA started hanging around my house, hoping to find me outside to talk to me. "Hey, do you have a minute? There's something we need to discuss urgently. It's about the new resort." It's always the same. I'd smile, pretend to be busy, and say that we could talk soon. But time passed, and they began to get restless. The first doubts began to arise between them. "He hasn't signed anything yet, has he? Can we really do this without his permission? I think we should sort it out soon." But then some HOA leader came along, probably that woman who ran the group as if she were the president of the neighborhood, and gave a show of confidence. "Relax. He can't do anything. We're already very far along in the project." It was music to my ears, because the more they spent, the harder it became for them to back down. By now, they had put marble countertops in the reception area, installed an expensive lighting system around the pool, and were even talking about building a sauna. Perfect. They couldn't give up any longer. They were committed, and that's exactly what I wanted. Because, when the time was right, I was going to bring it all down. The HOA was up to its neck in it. It was a scene worthy of a documentary about bad financial decisions. A neighborhood organization, created to decide the ideal height of fences and the color of mailboxes, now involved in building a resort as if they were real estate tycoons. And I let them. I let them continue to sink, throwing money around as if they were gambling in a casino where the house always wins. Only in this case, the house was me. The project was so advanced that the residents themselves began to wonder if it was real. Some were excited, dreaming of cocktails by the pool and the gym they had promised to install. Others were suspicious, wondering where so much money was coming from and how it was possible without my permission. HOA meetings, once full of gossip and complaints about poorly cut grass, were now completely focused on the resort. It was like watching a cult grow. They truly believed they were building a legacy for the community, as if they were visionaries and not a bunch of neighbors with too much time on their hands. I knew that the chips would fall at some point. It was inevitable. But what I didn't expect was how spectacular the fall would be. The first sign that things were falling apart came in the form of an email. After weeks of ignoring me and treating my property as if it already belonged to them, the HOA finally decided to try to negotiate formally. The tone was interesting. "Hello, we would like to invite you to a productive conversation about integrating your space into the new community project. We believe there is a mutual benefit in working together and would like to discuss how we can reach an agreement that is positive for everyone." Translation: We screwed up, and now we're trying to pretend that you still have a choice in this mess. I ignored it. 3 days later, another email. This time, the tone was more direct. "We urgently need to discuss the situation with the new community center. Your lack of response is causing administrative complications, and we need to resolve this before the inauguration." Now they were desperate. The inauguration had already been announced, the invitations printed, the neighbors were excited. But what about me? I continued to ignore it. Then came the phone calls. First, from the HOA members, then from the lawyers they had clearly hired to try to put fear into me. They tried to claim that I couldn't block an essential community project. They tried to convince me that I had to sign a document making the resort official. But the best part? They tried to offer me money. Yes, after invading my land, spending a fortune building a resort that I never authorized, they tried to pay me a pittance so that I would just accept it and leave. The number they offered was laughable. It would barely cover what they spent on decorating the pool. My response? Silence. I let them flounder some more. The first cracks began to appear publicly. Some residents began to question whether the project was really legal. Others began to wonder why, until now, the owner of the land had never shown up to support the initiative. And then, finally, the day came when it couldn't be put off any longer. I received one last email. The tone had changed completely. We need to talk urgently. Otherwise, we may be forced to take legal action. Oh, how I've waited for this moment. I replied, "Good, let's talk. But don't worry, I've already taken the necessary legal steps." The trap was closed. The next morning, I made sure to eat my breakfast calmly, because I knew it would be a memorable day. The day when all the arrogance, and all the unshakable certainty of the HOA would collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. They had convinced themselves that they were in control, that they could somehow rewrite the rules of reality and turn my property into their playground without consequences. But the truth, the one they refused to see from the start, was simple. They never had any power over me, and now they were going to learn that the hard way. When I arrived for the emergency meeting at the community center, the scene was exactly what I expected. The HOA members were sitting at a long table, trying to look professional, as if they were executives of a large corporation. A few chairs around were occupied by curious residents, probably there just to see how this soap opera would end. The president of the HOA, a bald guy who looks like he spends his days tormenting neighbors over irrelevant details, stood up as soon as he saw me enter. "At last!" he exclaimed, trying to sound cordial but clearly on the verge of a nervous breakdown. "We need to clarify this situation once and for all." I sat down, crossed my arms, and waited. He cleared his throat, looking to the other members for support, before continuing. "As you know, we've invested a lot in this project, and we believe it's in the community's interest to resolve this issue peacefully." Peacefully? They were really trying to turn this into a negotiation, as if there was still a world where I could just agree to let it all go. "The fact is that your land is now part of a community space, and we just need your signature to formalize the integration." "Oh, was that it? My signature?" I leaned forward a little, smiling. "So you want me to sign a document recognizing the legality of this resort?" The silence in the room was delightful. Some HOA members looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable. The president held his pose. "Yes, that way, we could offer fair compensation for the land and ensure that everyone wins." It was impressive. They still thought they had some room to bargain. I took an envelope from my briefcase and slid it across the table to him. "Then you'll enjoy reading this." He opened the envelope, took out the papers, and started reading. The tone of confidence evaporated instantly. His face turned pale, as if someone had pulled the floor out from under his feet. The other members tried to peek over his shoulder, but I made sure to make things easier for everyone. "This is a lawsuit. I'm suing the HOA for trespass, property damage, and misuse of private land without consent." The silence in the room was now absolute. The president blinked a few times, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. He looked like a fish out of water, struggling to understand how he had gotten to this point. Then, one of the HOA's lawyers picked up the papers and began desperately leafing through them. In a few seconds, he realized the seriousness of the situation and turned to the president. "He has all the legal documentation." That's when the confusion began. The HOA members started whispering amongst themselves, some raising their voices, others trying to disguise their panic. One of the neighbors attending the meeting laughed quietly, clearly pleased with the way the story was going. "This is ridiculous," the president finally exploded. You can't do that. Actually, I can, I retorted calmly. And I already have. The lawsuit has already been filed. And since you clearly don't have a valid contract authorizing me to use my own land, this whole resort you built belongs to me. The impact of that sentence was visible. The HOA had spent a fortune building a luxury resort, and now I was informing them that it was all mine. Swimming pool? Mine. Wooden deck? Mine. Decorated reception? Mine. They had nothing left but a drained bank account and a huge legal problem on their hands. Despair spread like a virus. The murmurs turned into heated arguments. Some members started pointing fingers at each other, trying to assign blame. The HOA's lawyer tried to intervene, but even he seemed at a loss. We can try to reach an agreement. I stood up, taking my envelope back. I already have a settlement in place. Only now it involves lawyers, courts, and possibly a forced sale of the HOA's assets to cover the damages. I turned to leave, but before I went, I played one last card. Oh, and if you have any doubts, I suggest you read your contract with the construction company carefully, because I imagine the fines for canceling work at short notice aren't cheap. Chaos ensued. The HOA president sank into his chair, defeated. The members were arguing with each other, some already talking about resigning. The lawyer was trying to save what was left of their dignity. I left with a smile. The following week, the HOA's lawyers got in touch for an emergency meeting. Their offer? Pay me to avoid an even bigger lawsuit. But now, it was no longer about money. It was about revenge. I refused any friendly settlement. I took the case to the end. Months later, the court ruled in my favor. The HOA was forced to sell part of its assets to cover the damages. The president resigned amid a financial scandal. Some members tried to distance themselves, pretending they knew nothing. And the resort? Well, I could have sold it to get the money back. I could have rented it out to some company. But instead, I demolished it. Every brick, every penny wasted. Because, in the end, it wasn't about profit. It was about proving a point. The HOA thought it could cheat me, that it could pass me over. But they forgot the most important rule. Never play a game you have no way of winning. And if you like this video, leave your like and comment below.